Good morning. Just wrapping up on my way back home from a court appearance this morning. A little grand jury on my day off, which is always fun. Anyway, on the way in this morning, hearing about just a disaster of a press conference the president had recently. Apparently, basically inviting the Russians into Ukraine, which that's great. And then also apparently calling into question legitimacy of some elections, like the midterms, because his voting rights bill didn't pass. Which, of course, it's been pointed out to death now that none of those were in place during his election. So what does that mean about his legitimacy? But that got me thinking just generally about voting and voting rights and the franchise generally, which I think is an interesting topic. I like the kind of Heinlein Starship Troopers model of limited franchise. People get really bent out of shape when you start talking about limited franchise and get into what that means. But yeah, as a country, we should ask ourselves, like, what voting is. What are we doing when we engage in that civic activity, and then who should be involved in that process, and what should that look like? So, and I haven't read Starship Troopers. I've been trying to get through the audiobook because I don't have a lot of time to sit and read. Obviously seen the movie, and then I've watched Carl Benjamin's breakdown on the movie versus the book, and kind of the political philosophical points that it's made, which it really piqued my curiosity and got me thinking. And like I said, I'd like to get through the book one of these days when I have time. But generally, when he talks about limited franchise, and what I'm meaning now too, and what gets lost when people talk about it, is that in Heinlein's book, from what I understand, citizenship is available to everybody. And unlike in the book, it's not the super, hyper militarized society where everybody has to be a soldier to be able to vote. Rather, everybody can become a citizen if they want, but nobody has birthright citizenship. Citizenship is earned, and it's an arduous process to earn it. And it's valuable and scarce because of that. But anybody can do it. They just have to decide that they're willing to do the things necessary to obtain it. And so, I mean, even if, like, the only thing you can do is lick envelopes, like, they're going to find something arduous, painstaking, and lengthy for you to do on behalf of society for an extended period of time for you to earn your citizenship, earn your right to vote. And why is that? And the reason this kind of rings true to me, or at least important to me, is because if you think back to the movie Rad Checks, is, what are you doing when you're voting? You're exercising force, right? And all authority derives from force. And people don't like that idea. And I understand why. I mean, it's an ugly thing, but it's something I'm keenly aware of working in law enforcement, and people don't always realize that when you vote and you install legislators with a legislative agenda who are then going to go and pass laws, ultimately what you're saying is, I want to, via threat of state-sanctioned violence, compel everyone around me to do thus. And I mean, even if it's something as basic as, parking tickets, if you continue to violate that law and stack up parking tickets and not pay fines and not cooperate with the system, eventually men with guns will be sent to go round you up and get you in front of a judge. Ultimately, that's what every law does, right? Every law that is passed comes with the implicit threat of violence, of even deadly force, if you resist strongly enough against the authority of the state. And I get why that grates on people, And I don't like that, and I certainly have a very libertarian streak myself, despite the fact that I'm a police officer. I think a lot of police officers do, because they understand the mechanism by which laws ultimately are enforced, right? And that every encounter that we have with somebody has at least one gun in play, has at least that implicit threat of violence and death if things go awry because somebody does not want to comply. And people need to maintain sight of that when they're exercising their franchise, when they're going out and they're voting. If you are saying this needs to be banned or this needs to be mandated, you are saying, I want to send men with guns to force you to do this or that. And anything that doesn't have that implicit threat of force is optional, right? I mean, you can say that something is going to, be a finable offense, fine. But if it doesn't carry any consequences beyond that, you don't enforce the fines if they're not paid, then it's optional, right? It's not actually, doesn't really carry the weight of law in the way criminal codes do, right? And so if we're going to, as a society, via that franchise, via voting, exercise force and threat of violence against our neighbors, who in our society do we want to empower with that decision-making ability, right? Does a 16 or 17-year-old have the requisite knowledge, maturity, and wisdom to make rules that will put people in mortal danger? Or do people who were not born here and do not have a vested interest in the long-term prosperity and well-being of our nation and the people that reside here, do we need to empower those people with, again, decision-making ability to put people in mortal danger via the threatened use of force by the state to enforce laws, right? And so that's why I like the limited franchise model or idea, right? We're going to be selective about who we empower with that franchise, which isn't to say that nobody will be disallowed. Rather, it has to be a arduous and difficult journey to obtain full citizenship, and you have to demonstrate in that process that you're able to put your own selfish interests aside and sacrifice on behalf of the larger society for the betterment of the society, right? And it doesn't mean that citizens are perfect, right? There's lots of people that have been in the military or been long-term public servants that are not good people and not necessarily people we'd want to vest with that kind of power anyway. But we're controlling for the uncommitted person, right? Or the unwise and immature person, right? We're saying that you have to invest something of value to you, time of your life and effort, blood, sweat, and tears, and maybe even put yourself in dangerous, difficult situations for no other reason than to demonstrate that you are to be trusted with the future and the welfare of our nation and your fellow citizens and lawful residents, right? And that's what everybody in Heinlein's book who isn't a citizen is they're a lawful resident, right? They have full constitutional and civil rights, right? They're protected by law. They just don't have voting power. They don't have the right to exercise force against other legal residents in the country in the way that a citizen does by voting, right? And so if we did that here, and I don't know what that would ultimately look like or how that would pan out, but that's why I like the idea, right? You've got to demonstrate that you give a shit, that you care. I mean, how many people just go down their ballot and tick boxes and don't do their due diligence as a citizen at a very basic level to understand who it is they're voting for, what sort of policy they're going to advance, and then ultimately what sort of laws that will be passed and how that will affect everyone around them, and again what that's going to ultimately ask of law enforcement when it becomes to the point where people are not complying and we're going to compel them to comply. And this whole process is consensual, right? And there's the actual oath of office. And if you watch Sargon's video, I mean, he has that read at one point. I mean, it's very heavy on informed consent, right? You understand what you're getting yourself into, and what sacrifices you will be asked to make in order to obtain, the rights of citizenship and the franchise, that you're doing it of your own free will and you're not being coerced or threatened into doing it, right? So it's available to everyone. Citizenship is available to everyone, but not everyone is going to be willing to make the sacrifices necessary to obtain it. And if you're not willing to do that, right, if you don't have the best interests of your neighbors at heart, if you're not willing to make those sacrifices and put your own ego and your own self-interest aside, then no, I don't think you should have the right to tell me to go force someone else to do something at gunpoint. And I don't think you should have that right. And I'm open to anybody demonstrating that they do have that capacity. It doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from, what language you speak, what your social or ethnic background is, what your socioeconomic status is, who you pray to, or what things you believe, so long as you can demonstrate that if you're going to exercise that force or that threatened use of state violence, that you have the best interest of everyone at heart, and you've demonstrated that. And it was difficult for you to do it. I don't know. That's my thoughts on that. I guess there's also a lot of talk about Ukraine and Biden essentially inviting in the Russians. I guess it'll be interesting to see how that will play out. I was trying to remember when Crimea got annexed and whether that was under Trump or Obama. It's been a while now. But there's this concept called salami slicing. I guess the Chinese are fairly well known for this and how they'll just creep, incrementally, and they have this very long game that they're playing. And the Soviets are the Russians are trying to do the same thing to rebuild, basically Soviet era borders, and what all the geopolitical reasons are for that, and what a weak position they're in right now relative to the Cold War and how NATO has really encroached on their borders. So it's really understandable why these things are happening. Ultimately, Ukraine's a sovereign nation, and they should have the right of self-determination without Russia or the United States, involving themselves in what amounts to internal affairs. And nevertheless, certainly the Russians are doing that, and the current government in Ukraine seems to want our involvement in the form of aid. And so, it'll be interesting to see over time, I guess, whether Ukraine continues to exist as a nation, or whether it ends up kind of balkanizing or gets, just eaten away slowly by the Russians over a period of, decades. Hopefully there are more people in power than just Putin and Biden that are cognizant of the risks, and we don't end up in some kind of full-scale conflict. The world kind of seems primed for it. I know Tim Pool often talks about how we have this compressed view of history when we're reading about it after the fact. That this happened. Like, you think about World War II, and you had the, Anschluss and, uniting of Germany and Austria, and the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and then the Czech Republic being annexed and broken up, and all the things that led up to the eventual invasion of Poland. I mean, that took years to occur, But it's really easy to just kind of say in a sentence, well, this, then this, then this, then this, then, total war. And so we don't, when we're in the middle of it, see history with the same perspective. And so, things feel really stable right now geopolitically, regardless of how maybe primed we are for some kind of massive global conflict. We shall see. But it certainly would be easy to say, in retrospect, well, the Russians, began to reassert themselves, and Putin came to power, and they had the military action in the Caucasus back, I think it was in the 90s, and then eventually began to push further east, push back on NATO and Crimea, and maybe eventual civil war that was instigated by the Russians in Ukraine, which led to a Russian intervention. An eventual, maybe partial annexation or re-annexation of the Ukraine, and, NATO getting involved. Like, you could see how all that time compression from maybe 30, 40 years in the future would look like, well, it was obvious, right, that we were headed for some kind of global catastrophe. And why didn't we do more to avert it, or to act more decisively to put ourselves in a more strategically viable position geopolitically? I don't know, but I'm not the one making the decisions, right? I don't know. It's interesting times we live in. I guess we'll see. Anyway, I guess that's all I got for today. Maybe a little shorter video. Let me know what you think. Thoughts on all those things, on Ukraine, on voting rights, on limited franchise, and Heinlein. Let me know. See you next time.